The first image that still wakes me up at night isn't blood or a body, it's fabric. A pale sweep of cloth pressed against cold rock, catching the thin beam of a flashlight like it's holding on to the last bit of daylight. The air down there was heavy and damp, the kind that clings to your throat and makes every breath sound too loud. Dust hung in the light like slow drifting snow, and somewhere far above water dripped in a steady, patient rhythm. Lace yellowed brittle lay flattened against bone, as if it had been smoothed by an invisible hand, and then simply left. No wind touched it, no birds, no traffic from the highway miles away, just that still underground quiet. The beam of the light slid over a row of tiny buttons dulled with age and caught a faint shimmer of old thread. For a long moment no one spoke. It felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. By the time all of that happened, years had already passed since the last ordinary Friday we had with Hannah, but memory has a strange way of compressing things. When I think back now, I don't go first to the cave or the courtroom or the headlines. I go back to the hum of our office printer and the sound of her laughter echoing down a beige hallway. Our firm sat in a squat brick building in North Portland, the kind you'd drive past without ever really seeing, with a little strip of scrubby lawn out front that always needed more love than it got. On summer mornings, the light would slip through the narrow windows in long, slanted bars, catching the edges of rolled-up site plans and curling sticky notes. You could smell coffee and printer toner and the faint, wet earth scent that followed Hannah in on days she'd been out at a job site. I'd usually get in a little before 8, set my travel mug down on my desk, and hear the soft thud of her backpack somewhere down the hall. She never slammed anything. She moved through rooms like she was trying not to disturb the space. Her desk was 2 down from mine, pushed up against the window that looked onto the street, and it was always a gentle mess. Sketches layered 3 deep color pencils in chipped mugs, little jars of sand and gravel from places she'd fallen in love with. I can still see her there that last week, leaning over a drawing board with her hair pulled back in a loose knot, a mechanical pencil tucked behind one ear, the late afternoon sun turning the paper in front of her almost white. Our days had a rhythm to them that at the time felt ordinary and endless. There was the shuffle of clients coming in from the heat, the sound of the front door's tired hinge sighing every time someone opened it, the hum of traffic on the avenue just outside. Jason, our senior designer, would walk around with a coffee mug he never actually washed, tapping the rim against the backs of chairs when he wanted to get someone's attention. Phones would ring, then stop. A delivery truck would groan to a halt out front, men rolling out pallets of pavers or boxes of native shrubs. Over all of that, the sound of Hannah's pen scratching across tracing paper would run like a small, steady stream. She'd grown up, she told me, between classrooms and tree lines. Her mother, Margaret, had taught geometry at the high school in Salem for decades, while her father, Daniel, spent his summers and some winters in the field, reading rock walls in the national forest. When we were stuck inside with a deadline, she'd talk about those summers as if they were some kind of quiet, holy time. She'd describe damp tents and early mornings when the fog sat low over the tree line, how her dad would show her how to tell direction by the way the moss grew, or how the wind carved the limbs. As she talked, the office would fall away a little. You could almost smell pine sap instead of dry erase markers. By that August, you could see the tiredness on her if you knew her well. Not the dramatic kind, just the slow-fading edges. The public garden project she'd been working on had eaten up most of her summer late nights refining planting plans, reworking irrigation layouts for a city official who changed his mind every week. She'd sit in the break room under the buzz of the fluorescent light, nursing a mug of coffee at 9 or 10 at night, and joke that caffeine had replaced her blood. Still, her lines on paper were steady, and her voice when clients called was as even and gentle as ever. The heat that week pressed down on the city in that particular Portland way, humid close with the sky a pale hazy blue that never quite looked clean. Streets radiated warmth even after dark. The air through the cracked office windows carried the smell of hot asphalt and the distant tang of the river. On my drive home in the evenings, I'd pass sprinklers arcing over tiny front yards, kids' bikes tossed in crooked piles, someone grilling on an apartment balcony with a radio playing old rock too loud. Inside our office, the air conditioner rattled and sighed, doing its best, but the fan on Hannah's desk still spun non-stop, scattering loose, sticky notes whenever someone opened the door too fast. She talked more often that month about needing quiet. Not dramatically, just in small passing comments. One afternoon, as we waited for the copier to spit out a set of revised blueprints, she rubbed at the stiffness in the back of her neck and said, "You ever get the feeling the noise here doesn't turn off even when you go home?" The copier beeped. Somewhere down the hall, the phone rang. I remember telling her that was what Netflix was for, and she smiled, but her eyes had that faraway look she got when she was thinking about the woods instead of streets. Her apartment in North Portland fit her better than our beige office ever did. The first time I went over there, years before she warned me it was more of a studio than anything, and she was right. The place was on the second floor of an aging building with peeling paint and a metal stair rail that stayed cold even in July. When you walked inside, you could taste dust and old wood and something green pressed leaves maybe, or the damp soil of potted ferns clustered by the window. Jars lined the shelves, each one carefully labeled in her small, neat handwriting. Drift sand, Newport glacial gravel, East Fork volcanic rock, trip with Dad. An old Nikon camera, the same one she'd been using since college, usually sat on the table by the window, its strap coiled beside it like a sleeping snake. She didn't own much for the sake of owning it. Her furniture was mismatched and soft around the edges. A second-hand couch with a faded floral print, a low wooden table with rings from too many coffee cups. A narrow bed pushed against the far wall under a framed topographic map. The map was of the Willamette National Forest, a tangle of contour lines and fine print worn in the spots her fingers had traced again and again over the years. When the evening light came in, it turned the paper a warm gold and picked up the tiny pinpricks where she'd once marked trailheads with different colored tacks. Her neighbor across the hall, a woman named Evelyn who worked nights at a nursing home, would sometimes sit out on the shared landing with a cigarette in hand. Smoke would drift lazily through the metal slats, mixing with the smell of someone frying onions in a downstairs kitchen. When I visited, we'd nod to Evelyn, trade a few words about the weather or the latest pothole that hadn't been fixed, and go inside, closing the screen door gently so it wouldn't slam. It was that kind of building. Small sounds mattered. Travels up and down the stairs were familiar, and faces, even if you didn't know names, became part of the background of your life. Late that August, Hannah started leaving little clues that she was thinking about the forest more than usual. Her sketches, which were usually of urban courtyards, rooftop gardens, and tight backyard lots, began to sprout taller tree lines in the margins. During lunch breaks, instead of scrolling through her phone, she'd spread out old maps on her desk, running a thumb along trails whose names she knew by heart. One day, I walked past her station and caught a glimpse of a path labeled Silver Creek Trail, circled once in red ink. She looked up, saw me looking, and tapped the page. "Dad used to park near here," she said. "We'd camp not too far from this bend. It's quieter out there than most people think." Her mother would call sometimes in the evenings, while we were still at the office, the sound of Margaret's careful, measured voice just audible when Hannah pressed the phone to her shoulder and tried to type at the same time. They'd talk about small things, prescriptions, neighbors back in Salem, some former student who'd run into Margaret at the grocery store and said hello. When she hung up, she'd give this small private smile. Once after one of those calls, she told me Mom thinks I work too much. Dad thinks I don't get out into the field enough. She shrugged, then glanced toward the window where the sky was starting to turn the color of worn denim. They're both probably right. In the middle of that week, she sent me an email from across the room instead of just standing up to talk the way people do when they're tired. It was a photo she'd taken years earlier, a stand of tall firs in morning fog, the light coming sideways through the trunks like something you didn't want to breathe too loudly around. Underneath, she'd written, "Sometimes I feel like this place is still calling dibs on me." I remember laughing, typing back something about clients and city contracts not wanting to lose her to the trees, but when I glanced over at her desk, she was just looking at her screen lips, quietly folded, drumming her fingers once on the edge of the keyboard. Thursday night bled into Friday with barely a line between them. We stayed late at the office finishing the last of the documentation for that big public garden job. The building was mostly dark except for our wing, the hallway humming with the low constant buzz of fluorescent bulbs that should have been replaced years ago. Outside, through the narrow windows, I could see the sheen of streetlights on the hood of Hannah's car and the soft flare of a bus idling at the stop down the block. Inside, the air was cool but dry, and you could hear every little thing, the creak of someone shifting in their chair, the click of a mouse, the faint whir of the AC unit trying to keep up. At some point near 9, Jason leaned against the doorframe of our shared office, one shoulder pressed to the wood, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled. "You two should go home," he said, his voice carrying that edge of forced authority and genuine concern. "We're done enough for the weekend." Hannah glanced up from the layout she was reviewing, and I watched her eyes linger on the clock. It read 9:07 p.m. She closed the folder with a kind of slow finality and stretched her spine, popping softly in the quiet. "I've got a drive tomorrow," she said, almost to herself. We walked out together into the warm night, the parking lot lit by the jaundiced glow of tall lamps that buzzed faintly with insects. The air smelled faintly of hot rubber and distant exhaust, with a thread of something sweet drifting from a bakery on the next block that hadn't quite closed yet. Crickets were starting up in the strip of unkempt grass by the back fence. I remember the way she stood for a moment by her car keys in hand, her hair lifting slightly in the soft breeze. The city noise at that hour was muted, no rush-hour roar, just the occasional whoosh of a car passing on the main road and a far-off siren that faded quickly. As I unlocked my own car, she called across the lot. "Hey, if you don't hear from me this weekend, assume I found good trees." I laughed because that was the kind of thing she said. She stepped closer, resting her hand briefly on the roof of my car, the metal still warm from the day's heat. "Seriously," she added, smiling, "I'm going off the map for a couple days. No clients, no email, no anything." The way she said it had a lightness to it, the warm, tired happiness of someone finally stepping away from the noise. I told her she'd earned it, and we promised to swap stories on Monday. That night at home, the air in my little house felt heavier than usual, the heat lingering in the walls. I opened a window to let in what little breeze there was and heard the faint hiss of tires on the quiet residential street, the soft click of someone's screen door a few houses down. I showered, poured myself a glass of cold water, and sat on the couch with the TV on low, more for company than anything else. My phone lay face up on the coffee table, the dark screen reflecting the ceiling light in a soft, rounded square. At some point, half watching the news, I realized I was waiting for a photo from her, one of the forest shots she liked to send when she left town, the kind that made the city feel a little more cramped by comparison. No message came. The phone stayed dark, except for one spam email notification and a weather alert about a heat advisory for the weekend. I remember reaching over, tapping the screen just to see the time, 10:43 p.m., and feeling an odd, thin quiet settle over the room. Not loud enough to call worry. Not then, just a small, inexplicable prickle along the back of my neck. I told myself she was driving or already asleep and turned the TV volume down until the voices on the screen were just moving mouths and soft static. Outside, the streetlights hummed, and somewhere in the neighborhood a dog barked once, then stopped. The night stretched on, and my living room for the first time in a long while felt a shade emptier than it should have. I remember that Saturday morning with a strange double clarity how normal it looked on the surface and how wrong it felt beneath it. The air in Portland was already warming by the time I stepped out to grab coffee, that soft August haze hanging over the street like a thin veil. I checked my phone out of habit, rubbing the sleep from one eye, expecting to see a picture from the trail or a quick note from Hannah, the way she usually sent them when she slipped out of town. Nothing. Just the dark screen reflecting a bit of the gray sky overhead. It didn't trouble me at first. She'd warned me she wanted to be unreachable. But the quiet pressed in a little too firmly the way an empty house can feel occupied by something you can't see. By lunchtime, the heat had built enough that the sidewalks shimmered and the metal railing outside my place felt warm under my hand. I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for some ping of life. The rational part of me kept saying she was fine, probably somewhere deep in the woods with her phone turned off and her mind finally allowed to settle. Still, there was an odd prickling in my chest, like a tiny thread pulling tighter each hour. When I tried calling her once, just to satisfy that nagging thought, it went straight to voicemail. No ring, no pause. Just the abrupt click into her recorded greeting, cheerful and familiar. I hung up quickly, feeling a little foolish. Sunday drifted in with a slight breeze, cooler air coming through the screen of my bedroom window. Usually that first breath of morning calmed me, but not that day. Everything in the house felt faintly out of rhythm, like a clock running half a beat slow. I set a mug under the coffee machine and watched the slow drip of it, thinking about how she would have been waking up in her tent, brushing the dew off the nylon, probably making sketches by the early light. At least, that's what I hoped. I tried her number again. Straight to voicemail. By late morning, I sent her a text. Nothing dramatic, just a simple, "Hope the trees are treating you well." The message hung there unsent for a second, then marked as delivered and then stayed unread. I stared at that small, blank circle longer than I care to admit. Somewhere down the street, a motorcycle revved, then settled into a deep, fading hum. I remember that sound more clearly now because everything else around me felt too still. That afternoon, I drove to a hardware store on the edge of town trying to distract myself with a long overdue errand. The store was bright and loud, filled with the clatter of carts and the scent of lumber, but none of it stuck to me. I kept checking my phone between aisles of paint cans and loose screws. People passed by in work boots and sun hats, their faces unbothered, wrapped up in weekend chores. Meanwhile, every time I pressed the side button on my phone, that same black screen blinked back at me. It felt like shouting into a canyon and hearing nothing return. By evening, the light stretched long across my living room floor, turning everything a soft gold. I sat on the couch legs, tucked under me, a half-empty glass of water sweating on the coffee table. I kept thinking about the way she'd stood in that parking lot 2 nights earlier, her hair shifting in the warm breeze, saying she was heading off the map. I tried to tell myself she meant it literally, that she'd intentionally dipped out of the world for a bit. The idea held for a while. Then it didn't. Early Monday morning, the office was quiet in that heavy post-weekend way. You could hear every drawer slide and every step down the hall. I got in a little after 8, expecting to see her backpack slung against her chair, maybe the fan on her desk spinning gently. Instead, her workspace sat empty, untouched, the papers she'd gathered on Friday, stacked exactly as she'd left them. It didn't jolt me at first. Traffic happens, alarms fail. But as the minutes stretched on, that small thread inside me tightened again. At 8:45, Jason came into the office with a steaming travel mug, glancing around as if expecting her to pop out from behind a cubicle. When he didn't see her, he frowned, but not deeply. She probably took the morning, he said, setting his bag down. She earned it. I nodded because that explanation fit neatly enough, but something in my stomach twisted. Her punctuality was steady as the tide. Even on days she looked exhausted, she clocked in on time. By 10, when no email came in and her phone still rolled to voicemail, I felt an unease settle into my ribs. A dry, light tapping started in my fingertips, a habit I thought I'd left behind years ago. I walked down the hall to the break room, pretending I needed more water. The lights flickered slightly as I passed beneath them, that faint buzz filling the silence. When I returned to my desk, Jason was dialing her number, the phone pressed to his ear, his brows drawn tight. After a few seconds, he shook his head. Still going straight there, he said softly. A little after 11, he came to my desk and said he was calling her mother. His voice was gentle, almost too gentle, like he hoped if he spoke softly enough he could prevent something from cracking open. I heard him down the hall speaking to Margaret in that careful, patient way reserved for conversations you wish you weren't having. When he hung up, he stepped into the hallway, his arms folded over his chest. She didn't call her mom either, he said. She always calls. The heat outside had sharpened by midday, turning the windows into pale sheets of glare. The office felt warmer than usual, too, the AC struggling the air a little stale. I could smell the faint sweetness of someone's lotion and the dry scent of paper warming under the lights. Every little noise made me jump, a stapler click, the squeak of the front door, a phone ringing 2 desks away. It was just before noon when Jason came back to my desk and said he was going to file a report. It's probably nothing, he said, kneeling slightly so he was eye level with me. His tone wasn't convincing. She could just be out of range. But it's better we check. I nodded because I couldn't trust my voice. He stood, cleared his throat, and walked toward his office, the soft thump of his shoes on the carpet sounding too final. I left work early that day. I couldn't focus. The drive home felt dreamlike, the city rolling past as a blur of traffic lights and heat-shimmered pavement. Every time my phone buzzed, emails, weather alerts, a pharmacy reminder. My chest seized until I saw it wasn't her. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had shifted into that washed-out, late-afternoon blue, the kind that feels hollow at the edges. I sat on my porch for a while, elbows on my knees, staring at my phone. The neighborhood was alive in its usual way, kids biking past a neighbor starting a leaf blower, a dog barking behind a fence. All that normalcy was somehow louder against the quiet from her end. I called her once more, barely breathing as it rang. This time there was a tiny hitch before her voicemail greeting played, and for a heartbeat I thought she'd pick up. When she didn't, something in me sagged. A little after 6, as the sun began to soften behind the rooftops, I got a call from Jason. His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness under it. "I've reported her as missing," he said. "The police will call her mother next." I'm sorry. I know this is hard to hear." The wind rustled through the maple tree near my porch, lifting the leaves in a slow ripple. I could smell charcoal from a grill down the street, that faint, smoky sweetness that usually felt comforting. Tonight it made my throat tighten. Not long after, I found myself pacing through my living room, touching objects without realizing it, the back of a chair, the edge of the kitchen counter, the cool surface of a lamp. The house felt too still, the ceiling fan whirring overhead like a distant hum. I tried to picture her step by step that Saturday morning, loading her pack, locking or not locking her door, stepping into the early light. But each image dissolved into something fragile and unfinished. When dusk finally settled, it did so quietly, the sky turning that soft bruise purple that comes before full dark. Porch lights flickered on, up and down the street. The neighborhood slowed, then settled. I sat back down on the porch steps with a sweater around my shoulders, listening to the cicadas rise and fall like waves. In the far distance, a siren wailed, once long and low, then faded. It was almost fully dark when a set of headlights turned onto my street, slow, deliberate moving with the kind of caution you don't see from regular traffic. The car rolled to a stop in front of my house, engine purring softly in the warm evening air. When the door opened, I saw the silhouette of a uniform step out. The figure paused a moment, adjusting something at his belt, then walked toward me with a measured, steady pace. As he reached the bottom step, he removed his hat, holding it in both hands. And even before he spoke, I felt a cold weight settle deep in my chest, the kind that tells you your world is about to break open. The deputy on my porch that night spoke softly the way someone does when they know the ground beneath you has just shifted. He didn't say much, just that they'd taken a missing person report, that patrol units were alerted, and that they would begin with the basics at first light. When he stepped back toward his cruiser, the red glow of the tail light washed briefly over my front steps, then dissolved into the warm August dark. I remember standing there long after the engine faded, listening to the hum of the street lamp overhead and feeling a thin tremor work its way through my chest. It was the first moment I realized this wasn't just worry anymore. Something larger had begun to move something with a weight none of us could name yet. At dawn the next morning, I drove east toward the sheriff's substation where they'd asked me to come for a brief statement. The sky was a pale, colorless blue, the kind that makes you pull your jacket a little tighter, even when the air is warm. When I stepped into the parking lot, I saw 2 county cruisers idling with their lights dark, and a forest ranger jeep parked off to the side with a topo map already spread across its hood. The quiet inside that lot felt different somehow, not absence, but anticipation. Through the open doorway, I could hear radios hissing faintly and the steady shuffle of boots across tile. They spoke to me kindly, patiently, but their eyes held that searching quality I'd only ever seen in doctors giving bad news. One of the deputies, a middle-aged man with a sunburnt neck and a voice like gravel, asked about her habits, her trips, the gear she normally packed. He took notes without looking down, pen moving lightly against his pad. The room smelled faintly of dust coffee and the lingering cold of an overworked air conditioner. When I finished, he capped his pen and told me they were sending units to the Willamette National Forest trailheads, starting with the area she knew best. It's routine, he said, but there was a softness in the way he set the notepad down that told me he knew better. By mid-morning, I found myself standing beside the ranger jeep, watching 2 officers fold a larger trail map between them. Their fingers traced lines through dense green sections following creeks, contour lines, and old service roads she might have used. A helicopter thumped overhead, its blades cutting the warm air with a rhythmic pulse that settled in my chest. A search dog barked once from the back of a nearby truck, eager and restless. Volunteers from nearby towns began drifting, and retirees with canvas hats, seasoned hikers with radios clipped to their packs, a few teenagers with nervous faces. The parking lot slowly filled with the smell of sunscreen pine resin from the open trunks and coffee poured from dented thermoses. We drove up into the hills together, winding through slow, narrow roads where the trees leaned close overhead, filtering the sun into shaky patches of light. At the first trailhead, a cluster of rangers gathered around a portable table where the big laminated map had been pinned down with stones. Radios crackled with half-heard updates. Someone scribbled notes with a thick marker that squeaked against the plastic surface. The air smelled of warm soil and dust rising with every step. When I stepped out of my car, the heat hit me full in the face, and the hum of insects filled my ears like static. They found her car not far from that trailhead, her old silver Subaru pulled neatly into a gravel turnout under a few overhanging fir branches. The sight of it knocked the wind out of me. The windows were rolled up and the windshield was dotted with a thin layer of dust, but the car itself looked untouched, as if she'd parked it only hours earlier instead of days. A ranger gently opened the driver's door with gloved hands, and the hinges let out a soft groan in the stillness. Inside, everything was exactly where you'd expect it to be. Cup holder, empty seat adjusted to her height, no sign of a struggle or haste. It was the normalness of it that chilled me most. Nothing out of place. Nothing to guide us. Search teams fanned out quickly, moving along the Silver Creek Trail in 2 lines. I wasn't allowed past the command line, but I followed the group with my eyes until they disappeared into the dense green. The forest swallowed them fast, first the colors of their jackets, then the shapes of their bodies, then even the murmur of their voices. Only the occasional call over the radio floated back muffled by the trees. The air near the trail was cooler, smelling of damp bark, fir needles, and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. Hours passed. Each time a ranger emerged from the trees, brushing dirt from his pant leg or adjusting the radio on his shoulder, I felt my breath hitch. Each time the look on his face told me enough nothing yet. By late afternoon, the sun burned hot enough that the shadows under the trees looked almost black like deep water. Searchers returned in small groups to check in faces lined with sweatshirts sticking to their backs. A few had found footprints, but only old ones worn down by time not distinct enough to be hers. Someone thought they saw a scrap of fabric snagged on a low branch, and for a few tense minutes everyone gathered to examine it. Turned out to be a piece of an old backpack, sun-bleached and harmless. A dog picked up a scent once tail-stiff body alert, but it led to nothing more than a dry creek bed where the smell vanished as quickly as it came. By evening, volunteers lit the first lanterns around the staging area, their glow pushing back the dusk in soft, uneven circles. The smell of campfire struck the air from a nearby turnout where someone had set up a small warming pit. I could hear the drone of insects thickening as the temperature dropped a few degrees. Deputies murmured to each other over maps, tracing paths already walked, marking out new ones for the morning. Every now and then, a ranger would glance toward me with a sympathy so deep it made me want to look away. That night I drove home along the narrow road in a line of cars leaving the forest. The headlights carved long white tracks into the dark, and dust from the gravel road swirled behind us in faint ghost-like curls. At home I took a long shower, hoping the hot water would shake loose the cold knot behind my ribs. It didn't. I barely slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I pictured her footsteps disappearing into the trees, the way the forest absorbed light without giving much back. The search early the next morning moved deeper. The forest looked different in the cool hours, softer, bluish with mist, hugging the undergrowth. You could hear distant water trickling somewhere out of sight, and every breath carried the damp, earthy smell of moss. Rangers brought out longer-range radios, and volunteers tightened their bootlaces with quiet determination. Helicopters flew low, sending the pine branches waving in slow, eerie ripples. Their rotors pushed warm air against my face when they passed overhead. Search dogs moved quickly in the early hours, noses, low tails cutting back and forth through the shade. Each time one barked or stiffened, hearts around me seemed to stop. But nothing held. Whatever scent they caught slid through the air like smoke. By midday, a group of volunteers returned from the deeper ridge trails, their faces drained not from the hike, but from what they didn't find. One of them, a retired firefighter with a gray beard and a steady voice, set down his pack with a thud and said softly, "She knew these woods. If she walked out here, she would have left something behind." He didn't say the rest, but I knew what he meant. The absence of clues was beginning to feel like its own clue. Rumors began drifting through the search site in low, cautious voices. Some locals spoke of wild animals, though rangers pointed out there were no signs of that. No torn fabric. No drag marks. Nothing. Others suggested she might have twisted an ankle and tried to take a shortcut off trail, but the surrounding terrain was steep and unforgiving. They'd have found some sign of that. A few more nervously mentioned other hikers who had vanished over the years in nearby sectors, but those comments were quickly hushed by deputies who didn't want panic spreading. Back in Portland, friends reached out constantly, texts, voicemails, quiet offers to help with flyers or carpooling to the search site. Every time I opened my phone, the screen lit my face in a dull blue glow that made the hallway of my house look colder. I'd sit on the couch with the curtains drawn, listening to nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car rolling past outside. Between updates, the silence pressed in, thick and unwelcome. On the third morning of searching, I drove out again. The sun had barely cleared the horizon and the sky was brushed with wide streaks of lavender. The air tasted crisp. A few volunteers stood near the staging area, sipping coffee from metal mugs, their breath faintly visible in the cool light. Deputies were conferring over the hood of a cruiser, marking new sections of the grid on the map. One ranger pinched the bridge of his nose, fatigue pulling his shoulders down. Even the birds seemed subdued, their calls sparse and flat. I watched as one of the dogs caught a faint scent near a fork in the trail. The handler crouched, encouraging him quietly. For a few sharp seconds, hope lifted the whole group, but the dog circled once, twice, then dropped his tail. The scent was gone. The handler stood brushing dirt from his knee and shook his head. The disappointment rippled outward like a silent wave. By late afternoon, the air felt heavy again, the kind of weight that makes your skin feel too warm. Volunteers drifted back to the staging area, their steps slow, their faces set in that blank expression people wear when they've run out of words. The sheriff arrived with a thermos tucked under his arm and a clipboard in hand, holding a short meeting with the lead rangers. Their silhouettes against the sinking sun looked like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. I sat on the tailgate of a truck someone had left open, watching dust ribbon through a shaft of light. The forest around us seemed indifferent, its tall trunks standing silent, the breeze whispering through the needles with a softness that made everything feel farther away. I remember brushing a bit of dirt from my jeans and noticing how my hands trembled. It wasn't panic anymore, just a quiet, growing dread. As the sun began to dip, the search site shifted into a hushed, almost reverent calm. Radios crackled softly. A ranger folded a map with deliberate care, smoothing each crease with the flat of his hand. Another stretched a strip of caution tape between two poles for the next day's perimeter. The colors around us deepened greens, turning to near black, the sky melting into amber and rose. A few volunteers packed up their gear, the soft clink of metal and zippers punctuating the stillness. Then, just as I was about to head to my car, a deputy stepped out from the tree line farther down the trail. He wasn't rushing, but his stride was firmer than before. In his hand he carried something small, something I couldn't make out in the fading light. He paused to speak quietly with the sheriff, who straightened almost imperceptibly as he listened. The two of them bent over the map once more, marking a point deeper inside the forest, a place no one had searched yet. And as the lanterns flickered on, one by one around us, the air shifted. Not enough to explain, not enough to name, but enough that every hair on my arms lifted. Whatever they had found, or almost found it, felt like the first shadow of something waiting in the dark. The shift came quietly at first, the way a tremor comes before anyone feels the ground move. I was standing near the staging area that third afternoon, the sun low enough to cast long amber stripes between the trees when a burst of static cracked across a ranger's radio. His hand froze mid-reach, hovering over the map. Another radio answered from somewhere deeper in the woods, the voice urgent but controlled, and every head within earshot turned toward the sound. The breeze had settled by then, leaving the forest unnervingly still, and in that stillness I felt something drop inside me long before I knew what they'd found. A deputy jogged out from the tree line, his boots throwing small puffs of dust with each step. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The set of his jaw, the tightness in his shoulders, those spoke louder than any words. He went straight to the sheriff, leaned in close, and whatever he said made the sheriff's face harden in a way I'd never seen. The sheriff motioned toward the deeper ridge, calling for the lead ranger and two forensic techs. They gathered their kits without asking questions. The radios buzzed sharply, then fell to a thin, crackling hush. Someone told the volunteers to step back. Someone else unfurled a strip of yellow tape. My heart was already hammering through my ribs. I didn't need confirmation. Something had been found, and none of us would come back the same. They headed into the woods in a tight line. Sheriff deputies, rangers, crime scene techs, their flashlights swinging low even though there was still daylight. I followed as far as I was allowed, stopping at the edge of the cordoned area. The air changed the moment we crossed into that deeper shade. It grew cooler, almost damp, with the scent of moss and wet stone settling heavy in the back of my throat. The light filtered through the branches in thin, pale ribbons, catching the dust rising from our steps. I could hear each footfall, each snap of a twig too clearly, as if the forest itself had fallen into a breathless hush. We walked until the trail narrowed and dipped toward a dark cleft between two massive outcrops. A cold draft seeped out from the opening, brushing my skin like a warning. Two cavers' hobbyists who'd stumbled into something they never asked for were waiting at the edge of the opening, pale and shaken. One kept rubbing his palms on his jeans in short, frantic strokes. The other wouldn't look toward the gap in the rock at all. A deputy gently moved them aside. The sheriff ducked under the low lip of the entrance, switched on his light, and disappeared inside. I stayed back, but the sounds carried the crunch of loose stone, the soft scuff of knees against earth, whispered instructions echoing off chilled walls. The cold that seeped out felt old, older than the trail, older than any boot prints. Minutes passed slow and punishing. Then a voice, the sheriff's low and steady, called for additional lights and a sealed recovery kit. My legs nearly gave out. The ranger closest to me reached out, steadying my arm without a word. His touch was light, respectful, like he feared even breathing too loud might make the moment buckle. When the techs eased themselves inside with their lamps, the cave changed. Their beams pushed back the dark in thin cones, revealing jagged stone dripping water and pockets of shadow that clung stubbornly to the edges. A hush fell deeper around us. The cold drifting from within carried a faint metallic scent like old iron, and time left untouched. Then came the sound, the kind you don't forget. A soft exhale, almost a gasp, from one of the investigators inside. Not fear. Recognition. And then everything slowed. They asked for stretchers. They asked for photographs. They asked for quiet. When they finally brought her out, the air shifted. Even now, after all these years, I can still feel the weight of that silence heavier than any cry. Her remains were carried with a reverence I cannot describe, wrapped, shielded, protected from the world that had failed her. The forest seemed to bow around us, the branches stilled, the wind gone. Someone lowered their head. Someone else murmured, "Easy, easy." And I stood frozen, my nails digging crescent moons into my palms. The moment felt both endless and unbearably fast. They placed her gently in the recovery van, sealing the doors with a soft metallic click. No one spoke for several breaths. My own breathing sounded too loud in my ears, hot and uneven, like my body was trying to keep moving while my mind slipped behind. Back at the staging area, the sheriff approached me with a look that carried a lifetime of hard news. His voice was careful, steady, the way a man speaks when he knows there is no correct way to say what must be said. He told me they believed the remains were hers. They would confirm the identity formally, but every detail pointed to that truth. The blow hit me like a slow-moving wave. First disbelief, then a hollow drop through my chest, then a numb stillness that felt colder than the cave air. My knees wavered. I gripped the tailgate of a nearby truck to keep myself upright. The metal was cool beneath my fingers. As the night deepened, the investigation accelerated. The cave was secured. Additional units arrived with floodlights that cast long, eerie shadows across the forest floor, turning the trees into tall silhouettes. Forensic tents went up with the soft flapping of canvas. Evidence markers sprouted like small yellow flowers along the ridge. Radios buzzed with clipped voices, each one more serious than the last. A deputy stood guard at the cave entrance, his breath visible in the cold draft hat pulled low against the descending dark. I stepped back from the activity, hugging my arms tightly around myself. My mind kept looping through the last time I'd seen her. The warmth of her smile, the way her hand tapped against her car roof, the promise of tree-lined quiet she was so looking forward to. Every detail cut deeper than the last. Margaret. Her mother was on her way, the sheriff told me gently. They would meet her at the county office. He didn't say it outright, but the weight in his voice made it clear the news would be devastating. Hours passed in a blur of headlights, hushed discussion, and the shuffle of boots on gravel. When the forensic team finally returned from the cave with photographs and initial notes, the sheriff gathered a handful of us near the command table. The lantern light threw a warm, trembling glow across the map spread between us. His voice remained steady, but I could hear the strain beneath it. They had found her in a place no average hiker would ever reach, a narrow, unstable cave deep inside a network of old collapses. She had not wandered there. She had been carried. And the condition of the scene, the way she was placed, the way the cave appeared undisturbed for years, suggested deliberate concealment, not accident. They believed she had died shortly after she went missing. A single blow to the back of the head. Clean, efficient, without struggle. Then came the detail that hollowed me out completely. She hadn't been wearing her own clothes. What they found her in had no connection to her belongings, her life, her world. Something old, something that didn't belong in 2016, something placed on her by someone who had planned more than a simple attack. The sheriff told us they had located a person of interest, a reclusive former logger named Edward Harlan, 63, living alone on a patch of land not far from the forest's edge. His name wasn't new to them. Over the past decade, hikers had reported unsettling encounters with an older man in that same sector. No crime ever tied to him, but enough unease to mark his name in old files. Now, with the cave's condition and her injuries, he was no longer just a name. The truth unraveled fast after that. A search warrant for Harlan's cabin led to a hidden basement with shelves of meticulously labeled items, trinkets, photographs, scraps of clothing belonging to women who had passed through the forest over the years. In the far corner was a locked box with a leather-bound journal inside. Its pages detailed a twisted ritual he had carried for decades, the reenactment of a wedding that never happened after a fiancée left him in the 1970s. Every woman he stalked was a stand-in for that old wound. Some escaped, some didn't. My friend had crossed his path at the worst possible moment. Harlan was arrested without resistance. Deputies said he looked tired, like a man who'd been expecting them for a long time. In interviews, his answers drifted between confession and delusion, but the evidence was clear. Her DNA on the items in his basement, her photographs among his collection, the old garment in which he had left her in that cold stone niche. By the time the sun began to rise, washing the sky with faint streaks of gray and pink, the forest had quieted again. The staging area was still full of vehicles and personnel, but the frantic energy had drained away, replaced by a heavy, solemn calm. I sat on the back bumper of a cruiser wrapped in a blanket someone had handed me, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. My hands trembled despite the warmth around my shoulders. The sheriff walked over his hat in his hands and told me they'd be holding a briefing later that morning. There would be statements to give, procedures to follow, family to notify. He spoke gently, but the words felt distant, drifting past me like smoke. As the last lanterns dimmed and the early light crept across the gravel, I drew in a long, unsteady breath. The night had changed everything. The truth was no longer a question. It was a weight, solid, immovable, that we would carry into every room that day. And as the first reporters began setting up down the road, their camera lights flickering against the trees, I knew the long aftermath was only beginning. In the hours after they brought her out of the cave, everything moved with the kind of slow, deliberate purpose you see when people know they're handling something that can't be made right. The sheriff had us all return to the staging area while deputies sealed off the ridge. Flashing lights pulsed softly through the trees, tinting the dust in shades of red and blue. The forest, which had felt so indifferent the day before, now seemed to hold its breath. I remember standing by my car with my hand resting on the hood, feeling the metal still warm from the afternoon sun, trying to make sense of a world that had shifted beneath my feet. Her mother arrived not long after dawn. Margaret stepped out of a county SUV with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, though the air was already warming. The moment she saw the sheriff walk toward her, hat in hand, her knees buckled. 2 deputies reached out in time, guiding her gently to the tailgate of a truck. I stayed back, staring at the gravel under my shoes, listening to her quiet sobs float across the clearing. There was something unbearably intimate about hearing another person's heart break in real time, soft, raw, almost animal. The sound carried in the still morning air, settling into the spaces between the trees. News traveled fast through town. By mid-morning, small clusters of people gathered along Main Street, speaking in hushed voices. Grocery store clerks passed the word along aisles lined with cereal boxes and canned soup. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder outside the post office, shaking their heads slowly. At the office, our coworkers moved through the hallways like ghosts. Someone placed a bundle of lavender on her desk, its scent drifting through the room like a quiet offering. Even the printers seemed to run more softly that day. Once the sheriff's department had secured the cave, more specialized units took over. The forest rangers stepped back while crime scene investigators in white suits climbed in and out of that narrow opening, their voices echoing faintly through the stone. Later back in town, the district attorney called a press briefing. The room smelled of old carpet and burnt coffee, and cameras clicked in a slow, relentless rhythm. He laid out the essentials. The remains were hers. The condition of the scene pointed to homicide, and they had a primary suspect. Edward Harlan was taken into custody that same day. The deputies found him sitting on the steps of his cabin, hands resting on his knees as if he had been waiting for them. The arrest video, which I forced myself to watch only once, showed him moving with eerie calm, his expression unreadable. Later, when the sheriff told us what they'd found in his basement, the labeled bags, the photographs, the faded journal describing a ritual that had consumed him for decades, something inside me went cold. It wasn't just the details. It was the realization that she hadn't been his first, or even his second. The trial began months later in a federal courtroom with high ceilings and lights that buzzed softly overhead. Margaret sat in the front row every day, her hands folded around a cloth handkerchief that once belonged to her daughter. I sat behind her when I could, the wooden benches hard and unforgiving. Harlan rarely looked up. He kept his gaze on the table in front of him, fingers tapping once in a while as though keeping some private rhythm. When the prosecutor read excerpts from his journal, the words drifted across the room like smoke, warped reasoning, tangled pain, and a fixation that had swallowed him whole. The medical examiner testified about the cause of death. A single blow from behind, sharp and immediate. Her passing had been quick. That detail gave me a thin sliver of solace I didn't expect. It was the first moment in the courtroom when I felt my lungs fully expand. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, there was no outburst, no collective gasp. Just a long, low exhale from the room. The judge sentenced him to life in a state psychiatric facility with no possibility of release. Margaret closed her eyes and pressed her handkerchief to her lips. I placed a hand on her back, and she leaned into it just for a moment as if sharing part of the weight. Life didn't return to normal after that. It reshaped itself around what had happened. At work, we kept her desk untouched for weeks before finally packing her things with quiet hands. Jason boxed each item carefully, her colored pencils in their chipped mugs, the jars of sand she'd collected, the notebooks filled with sketches of projects she would never finish. The office felt emptier, as though the light had shifted and left certain corners permanently dim. In Salem, Margaret began attending a support group for families of homicide victims. Her voice grew softer over the months each sentence measured, as though she were conserving energy. She told me once that she still set an extra cup out when she made tea just out of habit. I didn't know what to say, so I sat with her listening to the faint tick of the kitchen clock and the hum of the refrigerator. For me, the smallest moments trigger memories, the smell of pine after a summer rain, the scratch of pencil on paper, the hum of a fan in a hot office. Sometimes when I'm driving through the cascades and sunlight filters through the branches in those trembling stripes, she loved so much I have to pull over just to steady myself. There's a stretch of highway near the forest where the air always seems cooler even in July. Whenever I pass it, I feel something settle at the back of my throat, half ache, half gratitude. She found beauty in that place long before any darkness touched it. People in town still talk about the case in quiet corners. Not often, but enough to remind me that tragedies like this don't disappear. They sink into the landscape. The trailheads in that part of the forest have new signs now posted by the county reminders to hike with partners to stay on marked paths to check in with someone before heading out. Rangers patrol the area more frequently. Even so, the forest hasn't lost its pull. It remains what it always was, vast, quiet, indifferent to the lives that move along its edges. On the first anniversary of the discovery, a small group of us gathered at a clearing not far from the Silver Creek Trail. We brought a few wildflowers, a thermos of coffee, and shared stories while the wind moved gently through the trees. Someone read a passage from one of her old notebooks about the way morning light filters through fir branches. Margaret touched the bark of a nearby tree and closed her eyes. I watched her breathe in the scent of pine and damp earth, as if trying to reclaim something the forest had taken. In the years since I've kept one of her sketches framed in my living room, a drawing of tall trees drawn in soft pencil, with just enough shading to suggest early morning fog. Some nights I sit with the lamp low, the house quiet, and stare at that sketch until it feels like I'm standing on the trail beside her again. There is comfort in that, and also a weight that never fully lifts. I think the hardest part is how ordinary everything seemed before it wasn't. A cup left on a windowsill, a map open on a table, a smile exchanged in a parking lot. Those moments still play in my mind with the clarity of film, unchanging, untouched by what came after. They remind me that life rarely announces when it's about to break. It shifts quietly the way evening light fades without anyone noticing the exact moment day becomes night. What remains now is a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow for the years she lost. Gratitude for the time we knew her. When I walk through the forest now, I move with a deeper respect, listening more closely to the wind threading through the branches, feeling the cool earth under my feet. I like to think she'd appreciate that. She taught me ways of seeing that I carry still. There is a moment I hold on to one that has softened with time. The way the morning light touched her drawing hand at the office, turning her pencil lead silver for an instant. That small, quiet brightness lingers with me even in the darkest memories. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.